Well, the opening shot of Spider is, it's the only Steadicam shot in the movie, and it's the scene, it's the one single shot that we use all the extras we ever had in the movie, just about. It's meant to introduce our main character in a single shot. And it really sets the tone for the whole movie, which is that there's a flow of humanity that is working, functioning, people streaming by, men, women, and children. They've got lives, they're busy, they've got lovers, they've got children, they're talking, they're looking at their watches, and they all stream by, and then out comes Spider. And you can see immediately that he's not in the flow of humanity. He is out of it. He's out of the flow. And from that point on, you rarely see Spider with other people, except for the one or two main characters that he interacts with. And that was something that was not planned. Whenever we put Rafe on the streets of London, we would have extras ready, dressed in period costume, to walk through the scenes with him, dogs, people, baby carriages, and we had period cars ready to drive through the shot. But whenever we did that, it seemed wrong. So I would say, okay, let's get rid of that guy on the left, let's get rid of that kid, let's get rid of that car. And before I knew it, I was left with Spider alone on the streets. And at that point, I realized that we were making an expressionistic film. And I mean that in the sense of that rather than it being accurate in terms of what the streets of London look like, it was expressing what Spider's inner state was. That's what we were really filming, was the interior of Spider's mind. And we accepted that when we saw Spider alone, he was really alone. You would feel his isolation, his inability to connect, his inability to communicate.
David is the perfect director to deal with it, because his interest is in the human psyche, and he too could relate to Spider in some way. I mean, maybe this tells you something about us, but...
Well, Cronenberg is one of the few directors, I think, where you put his name in front of a film and an audience have an expectation of it.
His appetite for material as dark as this is, of course, legendary. This is a filmmaker who of course, has a very powerful and a lucid and articulate interest in those bleaker and more remote frontiers of the human psyche.
Well, I was on a panel with Ray Fiennes and Patrick, and I said, for me, the movie is about the human condition in a universal way. And I'm not interested in having a checklist of symptoms of schizophrenia that we'll mark off. I want us to be free to create Spider in any direction that we feel we must, and not worry about what's clinically correct or not. And then Patrick said, well, when I wrote the book, I wanted to do exactly that, what Cronenberg didn't want to do. He said, I started off wanting to do an accurate clinical dissection of a schizophrenic mind. He said, but even for me, once the character began to become specific and become a real person, he took over and started to do things that were not in the canon of, quote, schizophrenia, which is still a very controversial subject in terms of diagnosis. What is really schizophrenic? What would you call schizophrenia? What would you not?
I think that this film, when people see it, although it is about a deeply disturbed person, Spider, and we might like to sit back and think, well, of course I'm not schizophrenic, I'm not that disturbed, I haven't been in prison, I haven't done a great and terrible crime. But in fact, when one thinks about it, all of us in times of stress, of grief, of great excitement, do somewhat turn into another version of ourselves.
We don't mention the word schizophrenic or schizophrenia in the film at all, or even talk about anyone being mentally ill. The reason for that too is that I felt that if we labeled the character as a schizophrenic, it would allow the audience to have a distance, say, oh, well, he's a schizophrenic, I'm not, so I'm observing him as a case study, but I'm not really involved. But really, I wanted the audience to become Spider by the end of the movie. I wanted them to be him, and I didn't want there to be an impediment to that process.
His memory is embellished, and so he's created this whole past, but you don't know what's created and what isn't until the end. So the audience of the film are not going to know what is real in Spider's memory or what's not until the end.
He was, in this way, a sort of weaver of elaborate constructions. He was a weaver of webs, this little boy, and continued to weave webs into his manhood. And Spider's stories, in a sense, about clawing through the various concentric rings of falsehood and getting at this sort of kernel of truth at the center.
I think that we are all, perhaps, walking a fine line between what the reality we think is real and the other reality, and which one is the truth. I think people may well identify with this film in a very odd way.
What have you done? What have you done?
Just as if to prove that there are many ways that you can arrive at truth in art, I can recount an anecdote. I had a screening of Spider in Toronto very early on, and after the screening, a woman came to me, a middle-aged woman, who said to me, "How did you know about the bathtub?" And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Well, you must have done research." I said, I don't know what you mean." She said, "Well, the way that Rafe was lying in the bathtub, that I have one of those at home. My son is 26, he's 6'4", but he has been diagnosed as a schizophrenic, and that's exactly what he does when he takes a bath. He lies in that sort of strange fetal position, vulnerable and alone and afraid. And how did you know about that if you didn't do research?" And I said, "Well, it's artistic truth. I mean, Rafe had also not researched. In his research, he had not come across that. We all just felt it, and the way it was shot and lit and the way Rafe played it, it ends up being clinically, emotionally, psychologically true. And by the same token, there are many Freudian resonances in the movie. At its core, it's a family drama, and not at the center of that is the Oedipus complex. You know, it's a boy having difficulty dealing with his feelings of sexuality vis-a-vis his mother and his father, dealing with their sexuality and the confusions that arise from that. But at the same time, I didn't want to do a clinical study of a Freudian case history either. So all of these resonances are there in the film, but they're not schematic. I think they're very organic and very intuitive, and the truth that comes out of them is an intuitive truth rather than a sort of schematized clinical truth. It might take a second or third time through watching the movie that you begin to realize that even the ending, which now seems as a surprise and a revelation to Spider anyway, and probably to the audience, the revelation that he killed his mother himself and therefore had to fantasize a whole other scenario in order to keep this repressed and not allow himself to admit this. I think you're going to start asking yourself whether that really is the end, and whether that really is what happened. Because why can there not be another layer to the onion that you have to peel back? Perhaps, what if Spider's mother left him? And as most children do, he felt guilt about that. She left me because of something I did or something I am. And so that guilt emerges as a fantasy that he killed his mother, and that's why she's not there. So I think you have to say that when Spider's therapy isn't over, and neither is the audience's. You know, there's a possibility that we still haven't gotten to the core of Spider himself.